the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Like I said last segment, we have a nice segment coming up next as we will be looking at, yes, the group of 5 in terms of fantasy college football. This is a group of conferences rather, that tends to get overlooked, in my opinion, in terms of fantasy college football. I think that there are a high level of very talented players, especially quarterbacks, looking at these group of conferences. So I'm very excited to talk to you about some fantasy advice moving forward in terms of how to draft within this conference, because I think that there are going to be a lot of steals in this conference. Let's start off in the Mountain West, where there is a lot of discussion about certain teams, especially one in Idaho, and that being Boise State, as they get Malachi Nelson, a former 5-star recruit who formerly backed up both Caleb Williams and Miller Moss from USC. He obviously saw that Miller Moss is looking to be the starter at USC, and so he decided to move. A very intriguing move, however, to Boise State. A very talented team that becomes with him at the helm. But I also return a running back, a very exciting running back. In my opinion, one of the top 5 in the country, in Ashton Jonty. Last year, he had 1,347 yards on 220 carries. So he's going to be a very interesting player in terms of fantasy college football come the start of the season. And overall, I'm looking at Boise State as one of the top teams in the Mountain West as well. Do not sleep on any of their players. I'm very high on Malachi Nelson. I would like to see what he does in terms of moving from a huge program in terms of USC to more of a mid-major one in Boise State. So I'm looking forward to that. Another team to look out for are the Fresno State Bulldogs, a very exciting team on the up. They return Mikey Keene, a quarterback who has bounced around a little bit, was a starter at UCF, but last year, in his first year with Fresno State, he had 2,976 yards with a total of 24 touchdowns. He also returns a very stellar backfield with Malik Sherrod and Elijah Gilliam. So look for Fresno State to continue their run of form within the Mountain West. I like Mikey Keene. Maybe he's a very volatile quarterback, not necessarily putting up as big numbers as I would expect a non-mid-major program to put up. But ultimately, I think that he's a nice player to look at if you want a nice steal. Moving on to the Sun Belt, where there's a lot of change within the league's top team, that being the Coastal Carolina Chanticleers. Gone are the days of Grayson McCall, one of the best signal callers in that school's history, and now you have a QB competition between Ethan Vasco, a young sophomore, and an MSU transfer in Noah Kim. This is going to be a very interesting quarterback controversy, as both have some experience. Last year, Ethan Vasco, in some limited game action, had 778 yards, an impressive 7-to-1 touchdown and interception ratio, and 786 rushing yards as well, whereas Noah Kim, transferring in from Michigan State University, in some limited game action last year where he had an up and down season with some injuries thrown in, he had 571 total yards through the air, and he had a 3-to-0 touchdown and interception ratio. So overall, I would shy away from anyone concerned with Coastal Carolina. You're not going to get the production that a Grayson McCall provided from this Coastal Carolina team. But I just want to let you know that this quarterback competition could be very interesting. And as a whole, Coastal Carolina as a school has been able to provide for any quarterback that has come through its ranks in the past. Obviously, Grayson McCall was such success. But moving on to probably the most attractive conference, the most attractive player within that conference, Conference USA. And yes, I'm talking about Liberty's Caden Salter. What can we say about this kid, though it hasn't been said before? Just an incredible athlete. Let's just go over last year's stats. 32 total touchdowns, including 1,000 yards rushing for a quarterback. 12 touchdowns on the ground as well, showing off his dual threat ability. Last year, he was the third-ranked fantasy player, only behind Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix last year. So if you're looking for someone who wants to put up points in a hurry, Caden Salter is that mid-major quarterback that I'm most excited about if I were to draft a fantasy team and want a quarterback who's not viewed as highly as, say, a power conference quarterback. So Caden Salter is the name to remember if you want a mid-major QB, if you're kind of panicking and you want a guy who has been solid in terms of mid-major production. Caden Salter's the guy. He returns a backfield with Quentin Cooley in it. Last year, he had 1,067 rushing yards and 10 TDs on the ground. So he's another option to kind of show how potent this Liberty offense is going to be this year. But overall, in terms of Conference USA, Liberty is the team to beat. I think that Caden Salter is just too much for the rest of the league. He's playing like he's a power conference QB, and ultimately he is the quarterback from that league that I am most excited about due to his dual threat abilities. But last but not least, perhaps a conference that is also looking to break into the CFP as well now that this 12-team playoff. That is the AAC. I think that both the Conference USA and AAC have teams that are looking to go above and beyond, break into the CFP 12-team playoff, and make a shock run going deep into that tournament. But let's look first at the AAC, last but not least, with the Memphis Tigers. The Memphis Tigers, obviously, also another team that wants to break into that CFP 12-team playoff. They also have had a great couple of seasons over the years, and they return another stellar mid-major QB in Seth Hennigan. He's probably my QB2 in terms of a group of 5 behind Salter. I think that Seth Hennigan has just been a steady hand for the Memphis Tigers for the past couple of years. Last year had probably one of the better seasons for a mid-major quarterback with 3,880 yards, 35 total touchdowns, 274 yards rushing on the ground. So as you can see, Seth Hennigan rivaling Caden Salter in terms of production from last year. I think that he is going to be a huge steal for any team late in the fantasy draft. I also think that the Memphis Tigers have some interesting players in their backfield, and also in terms of their wide receiver core, they're returning 2 wide receivers who in my mind can be very interesting players in terms of fantasy. With Rock Taylor, he returns with 1,083 yards from last year, only 4 touchdowns though, so he has that level of production, but he still needs that touchdown total to rise. And also Demir Blankhamsey, 901 yards last year, 7 total touchdowns. So overall, 2 solid receivers in terms of production. Obviously, one in terms of yards, the other in terms of TDs. But ultimately, the guy who I'm looking at from Memphis is Seth Hennigan. I think that Seth Hennigan, like I said before, is the second quarterback in terms of mid-majors you should look out for in terms of fantasy. The last team that I want to highlight here, a team that hasn't necessarily been that solid all around, a couple up and down seasons, but a very exciting young quarterback who is returning. That is the University of South Florida, and that quarterback being Byron Brown last year, a very exciting dual threat quarterback. If you saw last year when they played Alabama, obviously the conditions in that game were dreadful, but you saw the spark that he can provide to the South Florida offense. Obviously, if the conditions were better, perhaps in that game you could have seen a huge upset last year from him. But moving on to his stats, most importantly, which excite me. 3,292 yards to the air, 809 rushing touchdowns for a total of 37 total touchdowns. So as you can see, he does have that sneaky good production. Obviously, if he's given the opportunity to grow and develop, who knows what that touchdown total will be for this year. He returned some exciting players in his own receiving core. In Sean Atkins, last year he had 1,054 total yards and 7 total touchdowns. Very exciting player. And Naeem Simmons returns. Not as much production with only 637 yards, but he had 5 total touchdowns. So looking at the AAC, those two teams, those couple of players are going to be very coveted if you want a mid-major player not going outside of the Power 5. I think that overview gives you a solid group of players that I think will have huge success come the start of the season. Obviously, the group of 5 as a whole wants to go to the CFP 12-team playoff, break into that tournament, and go far. So ultimately, I think these players are more desperate than ever to put up a huge number of stats, and your fantasy team should benefit from that. But that should just about do it for this fantasy college football preview in the group of 5. Coming up next, we'll be moving to the NFL, where I'll be looking at tight end rankings from ESPN, and then last but not least, I'll be looking at how they rank this year's exciting crop of rookies in my 5th segment. But we will be right back.